Well, good morning. It's Chris Chapman, President of the IIC, and we're in Sydney, Australia this morning for the last of the video casts that the IIC has been doing so successfully, I think, this year. It's been the most difficult year. The whole IIC has had to pivot in the traditional way we've met physically. We've toured the world in talking to the leading policymakers, regulators, business men and women in our space, in North America, in Central America, in India, right across Africa. And today we're being joined by Rod Sims, the Chairman of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. And I've been looking forward to this discussion for this chat really for a long time, because what the ACCC is doing in Australia with respect to digital platforms is absolutely fascinating. And we'll come to that. I just apologise at the outset for my my look. It'll come as a shock to some of my colleagues around the IIC, but I've had a health scare recently and I've not been able to shave, so I apologise for the lack of tie and the unkept look, but all good here. Rod, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
The ACCC has been a great supporter of the IIC. You yourself have participated over recent years very actively. Michael Cosgrove has been a great ambassador for the ACCC, and I wanted to reach out and say hello to Michael, who I assume is in Melbourne.
Yes, indeed he is.
Because he's been wonderful. So thank you for joining us today. You yourself, you've been at the helm of the ACCC, I think, for about 9 years. You've got a couple more years to go.
Yes, indeed.
I've never seen the ACCC on such a roll. It's front-footed, it's evidence-informed, it's making a huge difference, and we're going to come to that in a minute. I think you're, by way of background, you're a Melbourne lad originally, Bachelor of Economics. You did your Masters at ANU.
Yes, that's correct.
You've had a long and distinguished career in the Commonwealth Public Service, in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, if I'm correct. And then stepped out into the private world with Port Jackson Advisory, which for many of our viewers, I think Port Jackson's probably what the name for Sydney Harbour, is it?
That's right. The water sitting outside the building really is Port Jackson. So that was the name of the firm, but it really is a McKinsey offshoot. So it was really providing commercial corporate strategy, just like McKinsey or BCG does, and they were our competitors. Yeah.
Anyway, you stepped into this role in 2011, and you've got a couple of years to go. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
The current momentum in Australia with respect to re-levelling the bargaining field between traditional, I use the word traditional media owners and proprietors and operations and digital platforms is all coming to a head in Australia in the next couple of weeks, months. It's had a reasonably quick gestation period. I just wonder whether, before we get to the mandatory bargaining code, you might just take us back to the all-important digital platform inquiry, the ACCC, because I'm assuming that that's the font of the information, the research that led to what's happened subsequently. Is that right?
That's right. Look, the digital platform inquiry was the bedrock of what we've been doing. It was an 18-month inquiry. We had information gathering powers. It was an inquiry the government asked us to do. And so I think what set us apart from our overseas counterparts was that we were doing an 18-month inquiry, looking at a very wide range of things in relation to the digital platforms, so we could take a holistic look. We could bring our competition focus, because there was a lot of focus on market power. We could bring our consumer focus, and we could bring, to some extent, our infrastructure focus and the ability to look at access regimes as well. So I guess what is unusual is that 18-month inquiry and the breadth of our remit and the breadth of the terms of reference. So that's why we came out with such a broad report. Other agencies were doing wonderful things way before us. There's been a number of cases taken in relation to the digital platforms in Europe. There's been other studies done, but I think ours was probably the broadest, and that's what absolutely was needed to lay the foundations for all the work we've been doing since then.
So in a sense, the ACCC was able to stand on the shoulders of that earlier momentum from some of the regulators, particularly in Europe, I think, probably at that time, was it?
Yes, look, we had to go back and, we did start from scratch, but
Right.
we did try and get hold of everything we could from overseas. And of course, we're, as an agency, very well linked to all the other overseas agencies, so we could drag all that information in. But we did go back to tours, as it were, on where's the market power, what's the impact on consumers. We ended up, because of the nature of the terms of reference, looking at privacy issues, media issues, advertising issues, the very important programmatic advertising. So it was, as I say, very broad.
Yeah. Rod, let me just digress there for a moment. I found in my role as chair of the ACMA that it was very helpful to reach out to international colleagues, regulators, because they had the same challenges and resource constraints and, in some occasions, political pressures. Is that something that you've found of benefit, and have you availed yourself of that, reaching out to international colleagues in this space in the lead up to the digital platform inquiry and since?
Look, yes. We're all differently situated. To be honest, I don't think we feel too many political pressures in the way the ACCC works, in a sense, because we're a cross-sector regulator. You get much less political pressure than you do when you're focusing on one sector where there's a minister who's also got an interest in that sector. So we don't have too many political influences on us. But we were, during the course of the inquiry, contacting our equivalents in the US, Europe, the UK, South America, to some extent even Africa, and certainly Asia, the Japanese in particular. So it's what we normally do anyway. We've got, through our merger work, our cartels work, our consumer work, because there's an international consumer network as well as an international competition network. As you know, there's an international regulatory network. So we're involved in all of those. So our people have very deep links. So it's very easy to pick up the phone, or these days Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever, to have a chat. And so we did that relentlessly, and just shared experiences, learnt, posed questions. So when an issue came up, something's gone on in France or Washington, you just call up and find out about it. So very helpful.
So, Rod, we're almost 2 years down the track since the ACCC's digital platform inquiry, its report, the extraordinary amount of research that sits in it. What was the essence of the findings from that report? And humour me here, if you wouldn't mind. Was it different to your instincts going into it?
I think I'd have to say my thoughts going in were pretty much a blank sheet of paper. From my point of view, this was an area I had not had much exposure to. So if we'd have talked about telecommunications, energy, a whole range of other sectors, I would have had that instinct. But here it was very new for me. To use that Australian expression, for a while there I was drinking from a fire hydrant. And so I went in it with a very open mind, and I think our team did as well. Having an array of people inside the organisation, we could bring a very wide array of skills, and of course, to be blunt, people a generation or two below me have a lot more natural affinity with this, a lot more real world learned experience. So we quickly got up to speed. I guess going to your question, being a competition regulator, we quickly focused on the market power issue and tried to really understand that. What's the market power now? How likely is it to be eroded over time? What are the entry barriers to others competing in search and social media? So we spent a very large amount of time on that. And that was the philosophical underpinning of where we got to, because once you form the view that there is market power and it's likely to be fairly long-lived, and not only is that our intellectual assessment, but you can see it in the share price of Facebook and Google, for example, that the market thinks they're going to be around for a very long time. They've got the growth element of their share price is 60 or 70%, which makes it, the market's got a lot of faith in their future profit potential. So that, once you form that view, a lot of other things hang off it. So that's been key. I should add, Chris, one of the things that the government did post our work is give us another 5-year basically inquiry. So we now have a continuing stream of work. We're looking at programmatic advertising, ad tech, and trying to understand that market. We're looking at apps, which is a market fairly well dominated by Google and Apple. So we're really, having got that base of knowledge, we're now digging a lot deeper into particular areas, and that's going to inform our views on enforcement of the Act, and also on occasion, as necessary, advice to government about regulatory answers as well.
I'm glad you make that point, because it shows, in a sense, remarkable maturity by the government to continue to have a program beyond, to make it cohesive and enduring, as opposed to some sort of set and forget solution.
Look, I think the government has this government definitely has a digital agenda. They want to take full advantage of the digital economy. One of the other things we do is there's a thing called a consumer data right, what's known in the UK as open banking. We're the regulator for that, but in Australia, this is where you can go along to your bank and say, can you please send my data to this other bank who I'm asking to give me a price on a home loan. So you don't have to go in and fill out forms. You can get that within the press of a button, and that's going to improve competition a lot. Now, this is happening the UK's leading, but what the government has done is set a framework so that the consumer data right can apply across all sectors of the economy. So the first sector is banking, the second sector is energy, and the third sector is telecommunications. So we'll have the first consumer data right in telecommunications in the world, and we're the regulator for that. But that's a separate issue, but it shows the government's agenda here. I think what the government has understood is if you want to unlock the potential of the digital economy, you've got to be very wary of the pitfalls as well. And those pitfalls do come from market power. To what extent can the market power of the incumbents inhibit other players and therefore inhibit innovation that we all want from the digital economy? What do we do about issues that could arise with all the knowledge that the platforms have on us? That could lead to price discrimination. That could lead to targeting vulnerable consumers. So there's a whole range, and then of course there's the privacy issues, there's a whole use of AI. So I think the government's understood that if you want to get the benefits, you need to make sure you have a close eye on the potential detriments and deal with them both together.
I want to come back to that, Rod. Let's go to this month and the next couple of months, because what we've done is bypass the co-regulatory traditional approach. We've put in place a mandatory code. What have you done? What have you led with? What's in place?
Yes, so one of the 23 recommendations out of our main platform inquiry report was that there should be a code of conduct to govern the relationship between the news media businesses, the publishers on the one hand, and the platforms, which at this stage is Google and Facebook because of their dominance in search and social media on the other hand. And we suggested the parties be given an opportunity to come together on something voluntarily. But if that didn't work after 9 months, for there to be a mandatory scheme, the government asked our advice after a few months to say, did we think the parties were going to get there on a voluntary basis?
How's it going?
We said, look, our best guess at the moment, if you ask us now, is that they won't. They're too far apart on payment for content. So with that advice, the government then said, right, let's bring it forward and have a mandatory code. And so we've been consulting with the parties, working closely with Treasury and the Department of Communications as well, because this is, after all, policy advice to government. And I think that's important to understand. I mean, we are giving policy advice to government here. We're not about to take someone to court for a breach of an act. This is policy advice. So we're working closely with Treasury and the Department of Communications. And it's to bring together a code that would govern the relations between the media, the publishers and the platforms. And it will govern some terms of operation and also the basis for payment, so that the media businesses can get payment for their content that the platforms use. At the moment, they use that content essentially for free, and that, of course, attracts people to the platform, and the platforms benefit from that. So we judge that the arrangements you get in a competitive market won't come about here because you've got dominant players. So there is a massive bargaining imbalance, so you won't get a competitive outcome by leaving it to the players to sort out themselves. There's a dominant player here who can just say, these are the terms, take it or leave it. And to be honest, we saw plenty of examples of that.
So here's the big question, and this is what really drives me consistently. We've gone well beyond the traditional approach here. The ACCC is overseeing, providing policy advice on a really big idea. It's a code, a mandatory code to address uneven power balance in the traditional news media, digital platform space. I think it's the most fascinating development that's going on in the world. I really do. Am I overstating that, or do you buy into that?
Look, I buy into it in the following sense, which is that you've got now dominant platforms that are dominant in search and social media and in a few other fields as well. And they are having a profound effect on the economy. And there's been a lot of discussion about how best do we deal with that. And there's a big discussion in the US and Europe about, well, competition law can't quite deal with it. How do we therefore expand and shape competition law to deal with the problem we've seen? And what we've said is, look, you don't need to upend competition law. Competition law is what it is. And if you try to radically reshape it, you'll lose the benefit of what it brings. So you've got competition law. I think underdone in this area is consumer law, because there's, in our view, a lot of misleading conduct.
And that's where the code of conduct has a role to play.
Well, and then the third bit is regulation. You know, we are both an enforcer of competition law, we're an enforcer of consumer law, and we're a regulator. We regulate wholesale telecommunications, as you know, extremely well. So we were able to bring that broad perspective. And so I think the insight we're bringing here is, look, here's a problem, and this particular problem is best addressed by regulation. You won't deal with it by competition or consumer law. So it's a really big issue because of the importance of news media to our whole democracy and society. I mean, it's not called the fourth estate for nothing. I mean, media plays a fundamental role in how our society works. So anything that runs the potential to damage that really means you need to focus on it with great force and great care. So this bargaining imbalance, I mean, there's bargaining imbalances all through the economy. We could walk down the streets outside and see bargaining imbalances. But this one matters because it's a bargaining balance to the detriment of media. And so we've got to be very careful that we deal with it. And so the bargaining code is, in our view, the way of dealing with it. It's a regulatory solution, but we think that's the solution that's appropriate. So I suppose, Chris, why I think you're right is that this is dealing with the media, which is a fundamental part of our society that is inadvertently suffering because of the rise of the platforms, and we need to deal with it. But the second insight is you may need regulation to deal with some of this problem and other problems. And I think we should be open to regulation when it comes to the platforms, not just in media, but there'll be other areas as well.
Rod, my IIC colleagues are going to find this fascinating. There's a confluence of events here that has meant the ACCC is at the forefront of this development internationally. It's got huge implications for the betterment of society, social harmony. I'm absolutely fascinated and curious to know where this is going to get to.
Look, I think it's fair to say it is happening in other countries as well. I think we had one advantage which was important, which was the breadth of the inquiry. We had a terms of reference wider than, to my knowledge, the terms of reference of any other inquiry in relation to the platform. So that was a huge benefit, point one. Point two is we are a very broad regulator: competition, consumer, infrastructure, telecommunications, wholesale telecommunications, as you know. So that brings a breadth of experience. We don't have to turn every issue into a competition issue or turn every issue into a consumer issue. We've got that infrastructure regulatory focus as well. So that breadth was really important. And I think, the government has taken a keen interest in the digital area. And so it all has come together rather fortuitously, but, the government's interest, I think it's fair to say they're a world leader with the consumer data right, because that's going to be economy-wide. And I think I'm right in saying we're the only country that's decided to have a consumer data right economy-wide. I think also we'll be the first country to do it with telecommunications. So I think the government, there's a confluence of things that have come together there, Chris.
Rod, you've spoken on a couple of occasions about digital economy and the government's future agenda and the well-being of the country being prefaced on our developing expertise in the digital economy. This is another area that particularly interests me, and I just love your perspectives from an ACCC, given the extraordinary breadth of what you have oversight and regulatory responsibility for. I place an arbitrary number on it, but I reckon 98% of legislation is still based on an analog framework, and none of it is being pulled through a digital lens. I'm wondering whether you see that in other parts of your regulatory remit. What does that mean? Is that the reason why you've parked competition law and parked consumer law for the moment in the digital platforms, because sovereignty has melted because of the international reach of digital platforms? There's a lot embedded in that question, but I would love your perspectives on it.
Yeah, look, a couple of points. As you say, very, very broad issue. But I think the digital world has been evolving, obviously, quickly. We're all aware of those statistics that not so long ago Facebook didn't exist, Google, a lot's happened very quickly. And I think it's fair to say that the whole way we do things hasn't adapted to the digital world. What I find fascinating is that the pandemic has just accelerated one element of the digital world in terms of communication. I don't think we're going to be flying around the world or cities or even walking across town as much for meetings. We'll still do it. There'll still be physical interaction. But the ability to have really effective meetings off your laptop, where you can see people as clearly as I can see you now, and I can read your mannerisms as clearly as now. We can't go out for a cup of coffee after, that's true. But so I think the pandemic has fast forwarded the digital effect enormously. I think it is going to flow through to a whole range of other areas. There's no doubt we're still catching up to the digital world, and we're catching up in all spheres. So I think with competition, consumer law, they have a very important role to play, and they've got new issues to deal with because very quickly you've got dominance. Very quickly you've got a lot of acquisitions that merger law hasn't dealt with. You think of Google, it bought Android, it bought YouTube, it bought DoubleClick, and you think about how their market power is based, and those are three really powerful acquisitions, yet merger law couldn't really touch them on the way through. So now we've got these very dominant companies. Facebook, of course, WhatsApp, Instagram bought them, and they're the second and third biggest social media platforms behind Facebook itself. So, but competition law has still a role to play. Consumer law has a role to play. What we have now with the digital platforms, let me run it at two levels. With the media bargaining code, we've said, look, you're not going to deal with that through ex ante thinking about whether there's a breach of consumer law and taking someone to court and getting the court to impose a remedy. The court's not going to impose a remedy like we've come up with here. This is an example of where you need regulation. And I think that having an open mind about when we need regulation more generally, I mean, there's other areas of the digital economy where I suspect we'll need regulation as well. You won't be able to leave it to competition law and consumer law. And, Chris, you and I are both very used to telecommunications. Now, yes, competition law works there. Absolutely, consumer law works there. But as we both know, there's specialist legislation to deal with the market power that used to exist with the copper wire. In Australia, we've got the National Broadband Network, which everybody agrees needs regulation. We've got specialist codes of conduct in relation to consumers. So I think just being open-minded to here's the problem, what's the solution? And don't just look at it through one lens, look at it through all three lenses and pick the best answer. Pick the best, how do we best deal with the problem?
Well, Rod, that's probably a wonderful note to end there. You've pulled it together beautifully for me. I've not had to summarise it, and I'd love to revisit this next year with you.
Indeed.
When we can develop on those themes that you just touched on then, because I'm keen to get into those.
Yeah.
And secondly, we'll be seeing how the bargaining code's working out. So thanks very much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed this chat with the chairman of the ACCC, Rod Sims, who agency is doing some very interesting work in this area. He touched on the COVID explosion this year and some of the implications of it. And one of the other implications is that it's given everybody the confidence to know that they can move much more quickly than they've historically done. That's for next year. I hope you've enjoyed today's chat with Rod Sims, chairman of the ACCC, and I'll see you soon.